Hi there, I'm Simon Rafe and welcome to Brown Bag Bible Study, the Bible study that you can do in your lunch break. Now this is an introduction to Scripture, which will give you some information that you might not have known and encourage you to read the Bible. But most importantly, it's presented in bite-sized pieces, which are perfect to fit in with our busy lifestyles today. Now every week I will be concentrating on a small part of Scripture, either one of the 73 books of the Bible or a group of related books. And I'll be bringing you some facts and interesting pieces of information to help you better understand it. I'll also be including links to further reading, books, articles, podcasts, websites, that sort of thing, which will help you learn to love sacred Scripture even more. Now this week, the third of what is commonly called the captivity epistles, the epistle to the Colossians. The captivity epistles were written while Paul was in chains, and he makes frequent reference to the fact that he is imprisoned, highlighting the fact he rejoices being persecuted and punished for the faith. Now, reading Colossians, you will immediately notice its similarity to the epistle to the Ephesians. The letter deals with many of the same themes and even uses some of the same phrases. Now, the reason for this is obvious if we study the history of the church at Colossae. The worshippers there had mixed pagan practices into their Christianity, and Paul was concerned about this. Much like in the city of Ephesus, with its famous temple to the pagan moon goddess Artemis, a Christian belief was being polluted by pagan practices in Colossae, so Paul wrote to correct their errors. He emphasizes Christ's supreme position over creation, not denying the existence of other supernatural forces, but making it clear Christians should not worship them. Because if Christ is supreme, well, why would we worship anything else? Now, in addition to having similar themes to Ephesians, many of the doctrines of the church as Christ's body found in Romans are repeated in this letter. This repetition, along with the emphasis on Christ's supreme divinity, has caused some modern scholars to cast doubt on the Pauline authorship of the epistle. Now, a word must be said about this. Firstly, any doubt about Paul having written this epistle is very recent indeed. There is a consensus among early theologians and the church fathers that the letter was written by Paul. The objections to Paul having written it are very scholarly and intelligent, but they are certainly not conclusive or final. At best, they raise questions which can be fairly easily answered. Now, more of this discussion is found in the additional materials. When the issue of Paul writing similar letters, essentially repeating himself, is raised, we must remember that there were similar problems in different churches scattered around the Mediterranean. Now, rather than just send these churches an identical copy of a letter he had already written, which would be impersonal and might not fully address their concerns, Paul chooses to compose an original letter, albeit one which draws on similar sources to previous letters. Now, at this stage in history, there was not a definitive canon of the Bible, and so Christians in scattered churches did not have access to all of the same scriptures. Finally, with regard to the notion that holding Christ up as supreme and fully divine suggests this letter is a later work, now this is a very modern, liberal notion based on the division of so-called high and low Christology. The theory states that the understanding of Christ as divine only happened after his death. Prior to that, no one thought Jesus was God. The first three Gospels do not explicitly state Jesus is God, while the fourth Gospel does. This is held up as evidence the early Christians did not believe Jesus was God, and this was something added later. Now, if this was something that was added later, then the letters of Paul which make it clear Christ is divine are later forgeries. Now, unfortunately for the proponents of this theory, it is a load of tosh. Now, while the first Gospels don't explicitly state that Jesus is God, they make it very clear that Jesus is God. Many times in the Gospel, Christ does things, such as forgive sins, which only God can do. Now, it is true that he does not flat out state he is God, but this is arguably part of the messianic secret and a desire to encourage people to come to him rather than forcing them to accept him. Similarly, the letters of Paul all make it clear that Jesus Christ is God, even though they may not do so blatantly obviously. Ultimately, any attempt to use high and low Christology to argue the early Christians didn't think that Jesus is God is just a modern, liberal attempt to deny the divinity of Christ. It is a very poor argument indeed, and serious scholars give it very little credence. There might be questions about the authorship of Colossians, but any argument based on the assumption early Christians did not think Jesus is divine can be safely disregarded. Now, I've included a discussion of high and low Christology in the additional reading, and be sure and take a look at it while you are reading this epistle. That's all for this week. If you have time, check out some of the basic training series. Next time, we'll be looking at St. Paul's letter to the slave master Philemon. Until then, I'm Simon Rafe, and God bless. To learn more about the place of Scripture in the lives of Catholic Christians, I urge you to read Pope Benedict's apostolic exhortation Verbum Domini. The Pope encourages all Catholics to read, learn and love Scripture and to understand its relation to the Church. A link to this exhortation is included in the reading materials for every episode of Brown Bag Bible Study. Just click the link over there.